A phase box or wrapper can be used to protect a range of books, but in this video I'll focus on protecting paperbacks. I think using a phase box is the easiest and maybe the best way to protect and preserve paperbacks. In my previous video on making a phase box, I used a single piece construction method. Making a phase box from two pieces has some advantages, and I'll talk about the pros and cons as I work. And because no one wants to look at a heap of faceless wrappers on a shelf, I copy the spines and make labels to make the wrappers look a bit like the original books. I'll make 3 phase boxes in the video, with slight variations in each. If you only want to watch one, watch the last. To start, I measure the size of the book. I measure in a few different places, and if there are any small variations, I'll use the largest measurement. Paperbacks are usually easier to measure than hardcover books, which have often sagged in their boards, distorting their shape. The design I'm using for this phase box is based on one from the British Library's Endangered Archives Program. They have some diagrams showing the shape and size of the two pieces, and I find them very confusing. Their dimensions include allowances for the thickness of the material, but they don't say how thick this material is, but it looks to be at least 1 millimeter thick, and there is an order which the flaps are closed, but this isn't specified. I've made my own version of this design diagram, which assumes using thin card and only a few additional allowances and no order for closing. There's a link to the PDF in the video description. You may need to become a DAS Bookbinding Patreon at the free level to access it. For simple books in stable condition like these paperbacks, I use a thin card, 300 GSM, which is about 0.3 millimeters thick, and the equivalent to 10-point card in the US. For this thin card, not as much allowance is needed for the thickness, and only 1 millimeter is added to some of the horizontal component dimensions. Once you measure the book, you can print out the design diagram and write on it the book height, width and thickness, and then calculate the dimensions of the two pieces of card you need. These should be cut short grain to make folding easier. I cut mine from full sheets of card. The first piece I cut is the inside component, which is also the vertical piece. This has little flaps that close up the corners. I make these 25 millimeters or 1 inch wide, which makes them substantial enough without using too much material. I make some marks either side 25 millimeters in, which I'll use after making the crease marks for the folds. I measure in from the ends the outside flaps, which are the height of the book, then the sides, which are the thickness. If I remember, I measure in from each end and then check the middle panel is the right size, which it always is, of course. I then use a bone folder to crease a line at these marks. I'll use the creasing jig in the other examples. I cut the sides to leave the tabs. Once I've made the corner tabs, I taper them slightly. In the later examples, I just cut them with a taper right away. But for your first go, while you're getting your eye in, you might like to do the tapering separately. Then I fold at the crease lines. I don't bother creasing the tabs, as they're small and easy to fold. So what are the pros and cons of the two-piece construction compared to the single? The biggest advantage is that it uses less material. The single-piece construction has those big corner pieces cut out. The two-piece method uses about 2/3 of the card of the single piece. Also, assuming you cut the card short grain, all the folds in the two-piece are with the grain, making the folding easier and neater. On the downside, you have to join the two pieces together, and there is a bit of skill in getting these aligned just right, especially if you use the 3M tape, as you have just one shot at it. The two-piece method has one extra layer of card, which adds a tiny bit of thickness, but maybe you can look at this as adding some more protection. I don't think one is better than the other, and at most maybe the single piece is slightly faster to make and the two-piece uses less material. Now I cut the outside or the horizontal piece. On the PDF you'll see I measure in from one end and don't mark the final width, which becomes the closing tab. I'll measure this from the folded wrapper. I follow the same process. Measure, crease and fold. For the closing tab, I measure the width of the final panel from the folded wrapper and then find the center of this line and mark out either side 30mm or 1 1/4 inches to give a 2.5 inch wide tab. I cut this out and taper it slightly. Now I can use the tab to mark the slot that receives it. If you have a hole punch, make a small 1mm hole at each end and cut a very narrow slot between the holes, less than 1mm wide. At this point, everything can be folded around the book and the fit checked. It's easy to tweak anything that's too wide, and any of the outside flaps will be fine if they're just a bit short. Once everything has been checked and it's a good fit to the book, I join the two pieces with some PVA. You don't have to go overboard like I do. 2 swipes of glue would be fine. In institutional settings, they usually don't use wet adhesive, but transfer tape to speed things up. I'll demonstrate that in the last example. And that's the first wrapper complete. The second example is almost the same, except I use the creasing jig and other small differences. Instead of describing it, I want to talk about preserving paperbacks. I love paperbacks, despite being made of cheap materials and not being designed to last. But I love how paperbacks make books accessible. I would not be the person I am without paperbacks. I loved owning my own books when I was young, and most of my books until I was 30 were paperbacks. It would be great if all my books from this period were in hardcovers, but I just couldn't afford them. And I do love the cover art and the lightness and the compactness of paperbacks. I wouldn't have been taking hardcovers hiking around the world. Even the paperbacks were a stretch financially for me. It's hard to forget having to eat breakfast cereal for dinner when jam on bread was a luxury dessert, so I could afford Umberto Eco or Milan Kundera. Yes, I could have gone to the library, and I read many, many books in the library. I lived in libraries during my university years. But some books you just want to see on your bookshelf. And for this reason, it's easy to be strongly attached to these books from your past. But they were made of cheap materials, especially the paper, and were not meant to last. The low-density paper made of wood pulp has a high lignin content, making the paper acidic. All organic matter decays with time. We all return to dust eventually. The question is, how long will this take, and can it be slowed down? This has been a big question in large institutional collections which have been tasked with preserving books into the future. All manner of deacidification methods have been investigated and developed. It has even seeped into the DIY market with products such as Bookkeeper being available. Unfortunately, home deacidification is just unrealistic. Bookkeeper is a wet treatment which has been studied carefully, and even for treating single items, its effectiveness is questionable. Maybe there's a better approach. To explain this and to put the phase box into context, I want to take you back to the start of modern book conservation. In November 1966, a terrible natural disaster occurred. A massive flood in central Italy caused the River Arno to break its banks and flood Florence, inundating unimaginable cultural heritage, including huge and old libraries. In response to a call from help by the director of the National Library, leading bookbinders and book restorers from England rushed to Florence. As the scale of the disaster became apparent, more people were called in. Experts from all over the world came to try and save all types of objects, but the key group of book people came from England. Books have been written about this event, and the immediate intense period of restoration went on for years, and in some ways is still going on. Because of the immediate need, many new developments in book restoration were made, and a new field, book conservation, was started. In the early 70s, one of the key book people, Peter Waters, was recruited to the Library of Congress to head their restoration department, later called conservation. Waters brought with him other key people from Florence, such as Don Etherington and Chris Clarkson. These people identified a similarity between the huge job of preserving collections at the Library of Congress and the work they did in Florence. They realised that item-based work was not realistic, that intervention needed to be done at the collection level. They came up with the idea of doing this collection-based intervention in phases, starting with non-invasive treatments dealing with environmental and storage conditions. This was called phased conservation, and the simple wrapper invented for use in this approach was called the phased box, which is now mostly called a phase box or wrapper, and the approach is now usually called preventative conservation. Don Etherington is usually credited with the design of the phase box, though protective wrappers had been around long before then. Let's get back to my humble paperback. If we can't change the paper, what can we do? The agents of decay in paperbacks are the absorption of moisture from the atmosphere interacting with the acidic lignin in the paper, and atmospheric carbon dioxide also interacting with trapped moisture in the paper, producing carbonic acid. Acid-free or so-called permanent paper is made with pulp with the lignin removed and an alkaline buffer added to neutralise carbonic acid. We can't change the paper, but we can change the environmental and storage conditions. If you look at older paperbacks, you'll see the distinctive yellowing of the paper, which is worse at the edges, and often within an inch there is little or no yellowing. Often the tail edge of the page, which is sat on the shelf, has much less acid burn. The idea of using a wrapper on a paperback is to provide a microclimate that protects the book from the worst of the fluctuations in temperature and humidity, and especially dust. The edges of the book hopefully get similar protection as the paper inside the book. A simple wrapper will greatly slow down the aging of paperbacks. You'll notice all the books I make wrappers for in this video are in good condition. This is the idea of preventative conservation. I don't want to wait until the books deteriorate and the paper becomes brittle. Nothing can be done about fragile paper. I want to stop this happening in the first place. Some people think putting paperbacks in hardcovers is a way of preserving them. I believe it usually results in the text being exposed to the atmosphere more through the addition of a tail square, and the spine being exposed to higher stresses due to the usually rigid spine, square-backed case that they're usually put in. There are legitimate reasons to put a paperback into a hardcover case, but doing it to a sound book as a form of preservation isn't one. For this third demonstration, I'm not going to do any distracting explaining so you can focus on what I'm doing. The key difference in this version is that I'm a bit more efficient and cut tapers in the corner flaps without cutting them square first, and I use 3M 415 tape to join the two pieces together. This tape is often used in archives and other conservation environments. Otherwise, it's much the same with some close-ups and different angles. One of the things I love about my paperbacks is how they look on the shelf. That is lost if you leave them in plain phase wrappers. To try and recreate some of the original look, I like to copy the spines of the books and make a spine label for the wrappers. I do this very simply by scanning the spines and then printing on a heavier 200 GSM semi-gloss paper. I just cut these out and glue them on with PVA. With the heavier paper and the thick PVA, I don't have to worry much about grain direction or stretch or pull. In my case, the thickness of 5 books has gone from 150 to 165 millimeters, an additional 3 millimeters per book. If you wanted, you could manipulate the scans of the spines in graphics software to extend the width of the labels to hide any additional material between each book. I'm okay with it, but maybe if I had one of those series which make an image across multiple books, I might want to do this. And this does highlight one of the issues with putting books in enclosures. They do expand, and I don't know anyone that has spare shelf space. My paperbacks might have been cheap and not designed to last, but I'm very attached to them, and I hope by adding some simple protection, at least one more generation might get to enjoy them. I hope you see the beauty in your paperbacks too, and you might like to protect a few of them for the future as well. Until next time, cheerio.